Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Teaching Writing in College podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Skeen, and on today's episode 5, we're going to talk about the Elon Statement on writing transfer in the classroom. I'd like to have a series of podcasts about this one, and the reason why is because the driving question in this podcast is how can instructors in higher education leverage theory, science, pedagogy, and craft most effectively to help their learners with writing. And the Elon Statement on writing transfer really does represent the best of research and scholarship and thinking that we have in writing studies about teaching writing. And so it's really important to go through this. It has really, I think, changed my pedagogy. It's been a game changer in terms of what I think about when I go into the classroom, when I design a lesson plan, when I think about a curriculum. And so it's really worth covering, and it really is, I think, the thing that helps students the most in terms of, what the teacher can do or understand. And so it's important to go through it. And also just previously on the podcast, it kind of relates to what I talked about last time. Last time I did a transfer inventory. It was a lesson plan where I had students bring material from other classes, have them review the rhetorical knowledge from my writing course, and then have them look for opportunities to use rhetorical knowledge, including their own prior knowledge in other classes. That's really what the Elon Statement is all about, and I think we'll see that as we go. All of the things listed in the Elon Statement, all of the concepts or ideas in there, I think speak to what I did in my transfer inventory. So that's just kind of an important point to make as we move forward. So the Elon Statement on writing transfer, here's the title page of it. It can be found at the Center for Engaged Learning .org. There's the link right there. The Center for Engaged Learning is at Elon University. And as we can see here, it was developed by 45 writing researchers participating in the 2011 to 2013 Elon University Research Seminar on Critical Transitions, Writing and the Question of Transfer. This statement summarizes and synthesizes the seminar's meta-level discussions about writing and transfer, not as an endpoint, but in an effort to provide a framework for continued inquiry and theory building. As part of the seminar, ERS facilitated international multi-institutional research about writing transfer and fostered discussions about recognizing, identifying, and enabling practices for and developing working principles about writing transfer. So it is a very ambitious enterprise, and you may notice if you go in and do some reading in various areas in writing studies related to transfer, they will mention the Elon Statement or use it as a starting point for material scholarship or research that they are producing. And so a really important document for us. I discovered it probably in 2015. I'm trying to remember when I first, I was working on a book chapter in a book called Pedagogical Perspectives on Cognition and Writing edited by J. Michael Reifenberg, Patricia Portanova, and Dwayne Rowan. And they had sent out a call for proposals for book chapters, and I thought that's really interesting. I would like to do that. I know some things about transfer. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I was still trying to find ways to articulate putting it into practice, and there were things that I had done in the classroom that I thought had helped. And so as I was writing my chapter for this book, I ran across the Elon Statement, and that was probably in about 2015 or 2016 that I found it in Google. And so that's where I really started to learn about it, and it really has helped organize my thinking around my pedagogy, my classroom pedagogy. And so just an overview of the document. I've got a few different things here that I'd like to discuss. I don't have the full document here just to show or to peruse, but on my slides here, I've got a few pages. These are screenshots of pages that I think are really helpful in understanding the overall gist of the Elon Statement. And so on this one, we've got working principles about writing transfer. These are some of the main ideas from the document that they summarized and put into kind of an infographic format embedded in the longer document. But clockwise from the top, we have one here. We've got 4 working principles here and 4 on the next slide that I will show you. But for this one, if you're listening, this first working principle is writing transfer is the phenomenon in which new and unfamiliar writing tasks are approached through the application, remixing, or integration of previous knowledge, skills, strategies, and dispositions. And just from my own perspective, I'd like to try to just talk briefly about what each of these working principles makes me think about, or what kind of comes to mind for me. And for this one, the first thing that came to mind for me was expertise. Expertise, if you read literature on it in sources like How People Learn, expertise is partly about, sort of understanding what tools you have and then adapting them to new contexts. And so taking that prior knowledge and then applying it and using it to do sometimes something routine, but also sometimes something new. And so there's a lot there that we can unpack over time in this podcast, but expertise is one of the first things that I think of when I see that first working principle. The second working principle I have on the screen here is any social context provides affordances and constraints that impact use of prior knowledge, skills, strategies, and dispositions, and writing transfer successes and challenges cannot be understood outside of learners' social cultural spaces. And so this one for me makes me think a lot about adaptation. It's something that, I try really hard to make my students aware that whatever we do in class, whatever principles we learn in class will be changed, or they will play out differently when they try to take them into their other classes or into other aspects of their lives, their writing lives. And so it's also a really important thing to think about is adaptation. And one class slogan that I like to use with my students quite a bit is what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but what happens in English 105, which I teach a lot here at GCU, 106, 107, these first year classes, what happens in these classes happens everywhere else, including our majors and our careers, with adaptation. And so I always try to make sure I emphasize that adaptation. And in classroom activities like the transfer inventory, I like to say, okay, it's not just how will you use this. I like to use the word adapt instead, because there are so many different things. There will be affordances and constraints that are going to influence the way that they use the skills. If we go to the next one, going clockwise around the screen here, individual dispositions and individual identity play key roles in transfer. And that one makes me think about literature on transformation or transformative learning, which can be very much about individual identity. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me. I think, in that literature, they talk about how a person's identity can continue to be constructed as they learn about a discipline, as they sort of incorporate new knowledge and new ways of thinking about things. It becomes part of their identity. And so that transformative learning, I think, is really important that students recognize that what they're learning about writing, because, and not just in our courses, but in the places where they will use that expertise, it becomes part of their identity as well. The fourth one, going clockwise, prior knowledge is a complex construct that can benefit or hinder writing transfer, yet understanding and exploring that complexity is central to investigating transfer. And there, for me, what came to mind first was the idea of conceptual knowledge. That's also, I think, one of the enabling practices in the Elon Statement that we'll get to in a moment. But understanding and exploring that complexity is central to investigating transfer. It's about, what students already know, how they understand writing conceptually, and that framework, the frameworks that they have, the conceptual knowledge that they have about writing, as the literature shows, can influence the way that they use it. So the way that they perceive it influences the way that they use it. And for me, conceptual knowledge is about the way that they perceive writing, and we'll see more of that also in maybe this or future episodes. But conceptual knowledge is about frameworks. It's about the way we understand things. And moving on to the next slide, I have also more working principles. I divided these up onto 2 slides. Once again, going clockwise from the upper left. Individuals may engage in both routinized and transformative, adaptive, integrated, repurposed, expansive forms of transfer when they draw on or utilize prior knowledge and learning, whether crossing concurrent contexts or sequential contexts. One thing I think of immediately there is just one of the things that I've sort of learned, or the way that I've come to understand teaching for transfer, is that it is important to think about concurrent contexts and also sequential contexts. When I was first hired as a writing teacher, I remember talking to my students about how the material that you learn here is going to be useful in your other classes, and I would just say that, and that's as far as it would get. And I would assume it, they assumed it, and we never really did much with it after that. But one thing I like to do, going back to my lesson plan on a transfer inventory, is that lets them see how things that we are learning in a class can be used elsewhere at the same time. And so I have them think about their other classes that they are enrolled in any given semester when I'm teaching. What classes are you taking right now? What skills do you think would apply to this assignment that's coming up for you in a couple of weeks in your other class? And so it's not just about, what they might do in their next class next semester, a sequential context, but rather a concurrent context, what's happening right now. And I also sometimes get students tell me that they have used some skills that we have learned, some concepts about writing that we have learned in a concurrent context, maybe outside of school. Last semester I had a student get excited about how she had helped her boss, who was the owner of a restaurant, revise the way that his menu looked visually, and she drew on some ideas that we had talked about in our writing course. And so that was a concurrent context as well. And I'm always, just in casual conversations with students as I'm wandering around the room, sometimes I'll ask them questions about what's going on now. And then also maybe, ask them to reflect on plans for the future, sequential contexts. And so really important, I think, to think about what's happening now and also what's happening in the future. Next one, successful writing transfer occurs when a writer can transform rhetorical knowledge and rhetorical awareness into performance. Students facing a new and difficult rhetorical task draw on previous knowledge and strategies, and when they do that, they must transform or repurpose that prior knowledge, if only slightly. And so sometimes it can be a very large transformation, or an adaptation, or maybe one that's not so large. But I think one thing that this working principle reminds me of is just that one thing that we want to do is we want to try to have them internalize what they are learning in our writing courses, and then also internalize, the adaptation of it. It has to come from the student, and it's a very active, sort of purposeful. What's the word I'm looking for? Purposeful, and then intentional task on their part. And so trying to sort of inculcate that in students, I think, is really important. Also, clockwise down on the bottom right, students' meta-awareness often plays a key role in transfer, and reflective writing promotes preparation for transfer and transfer-focused thinking. And so there, one thing that maybe I went, I'm going in the wrong order here. So I see on my slide I'm in the wrong order. But with that one, that third one there, clockwise, metacognition is a skill that needs to be taught. I think that I try to give students frameworks for that. Students' meta-awareness often plays a key role, reflective writing. So I try to give them, frameworks that will help them think metacognitively, and I try to get them in the habit. We practice metacognition in our writing, and so I do my best to give them some ways to help build some automaticity when it comes to meta-awareness and metacognition. That's an important thing too. And this last one, I've got them mixed up over on the left-hand side of my screen. But once again, going clockwise, we're now on the bottom left for those who are watching. The importance of metacognition of available identities, situational awareness, audience awareness, etc. become even more critical in writing transfer between languages because of the need to negotiate language-based differences and to develop awareness about the ways language operates in written communication in each language. And I wasn't aware of this until some of you may know that I'm working on an encyclopedia as a co-editor. And in the encyclopedia, an ongoing project right now, there is going to be an entry on language transfer. So specifically, we can study transfer, but then there's also specifically transfer between languages. And so writing teachers, I think, need to know more about that as well, something that I'm working on, because I know that we all have students who may speak English as a second language and write in English as a second language, and there are some important considerations to make there as well. Okay, so that's it for the working principles about writing transfer, just talking through those. I think they're all really important, and they're worth pondering on at any point. And if we move on, so also in the statement are these enabling practices. These are kind of the core things that teachers can do that the Elon Statement suggests that help kind of guide pedagogy. And once again, I really like to think about these all the time. I'm asking myself, am I doing these, and how well am I doing them when I am designing material to take into a classroom, or when I'm designing a curriculum or a syllabus or things like that. And so here are the 3 enabling practices that the Elon Statement recommends, and I've kind of got them boiled down to 3 key phrases here, but I'll read them out. So the first enabling practice is constructing writing curricula and classes that focus on study of and practice with concepts that enable students to analyze expectations for writing and learning within specific contexts. These include rhetorically based concepts such as genre, purpose, and audience. So that's the first one. And to dwell on that one for just a moment, I feel like it has 2 parts to it. It's got conceptual knowledge. One thing we need to make sure that students have is conceptual knowledge that's going to enable them to think about writing in certain ways over others. And I'll get into that in my next podcast. I'd like to cover each of these in detail. But when I think of conceptual knowledge, I think of, what is writing made of, and is it, are we conveying that? Am I conveying that as a teacher in a way that is going to enable students as they continue in other contexts in their lives? And so one of the central ones for me is genre. Every writing course, I think at this point, I'll have to do this in a future episode too, but I think genre is probably the central concept that should be operative in any writing course. And genre also, if you look at the literature, it encompasses things like purpose and audience, and it gives us some really great ways to talk about those. And so I really like to use genre, and then I take purpose and audience and talk about them in specific relationship with different genres. So that's, I think, really important. And then also, of course, lots of other things, lots of rhetorical skills. If you think about the WPA outcome statement, it talks about the need for rhetorical knowledge. There's lots of rhetorical knowledge that can support our writing, my writing, my students' writing, anybody's writing, as they use different genres. And so I like to see genre as a really central concept, and then lots of other supporting concepts help that including audience and purpose. Another one right there in the first one is practice in these enabling practices. I think practice, giving students opportunities to practice with their rhetorical knowledge, is really important. There's a lot of literature, a lot of ideas coming out in education and cognitive psychology, or that have been around for a while. It's been established that practice is really important. Something that I didn't understand early on as a writing teacher, but it does mean, for me at least, once you introduce a concept about writing to students, there's you want to go back and practice it a lot so that they can remember it, and so that they can then practice adapting it in different ways. And so for me, one of those, if I think genre is a specific concept, one thing we do is or one that I use centrally, one thing that I like to do with students is I like to get them to practice writing in different genres. I like to practice getting them to interpret or describe, practice interpreting or describing different genres. And so also really important, just for memory, long-term memory, and then also transfer. And then have them practice that, of course, in their other classes that they're doing at the same time they're taking my class. The second enabling practice for the Elon Statement, asking students to engage in activities that foster the development of metacognitive awareness, including asking good questions about writing situations and developing heuristics for analyzing unfamiliar writing situations. I think that goes hand in hand, I think, with conceptual knowledge a little bit. One thing that I do have is I have a heuristic for genre that I like to use in class, and it becomes a framework. Students get tired of hearing it probably, but they sure remember it because I repeat it so much, and I bring in different kinds of writing that they might be doing. I ask them, what their majors are, what they see themselves doing once they leave college, and then I try to find genres that might correspond to some of those majors or some of those careers that they see themselves going into. And then we analyze those. And that's a really important part of it as well, that metacognitive awareness. What do I know about this genre? That's a question that we can get them asking. And metacognitive awareness. And once again, that's something that we can practice and teach as we go. And then so those are the three big ones: conceptual knowledge, practice, and metacognitive reflection. And we haven't even quite hit the third enabling practice yet, but excuse me. The third enabling practice is explicitly modeling transfer-focused thinking and the application of metacognitive awareness as a conscious and explicit part of a process of learning. And so I do like to, as a teacher, be active about that. One way to do it, I think, is to show them what I'm working on and how I'm using the same skills that I'm working with them on, whether it might be, some kind of strategy to create some structure in a genre, or the move between genres. I have to do that too, and I show them, there are genres that I am writing in right now that I don't have, that I have not historically had experience with in my career, but, showing them that. But then also one thing that I think is important here, and I'm struggling to make this connection, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. I think this idea of expansive framing by Randy Engel is really important here. And expansive framing is, thinking about how a teacher can portray material or portray activities in such a way that the thinking about them is not limited to the classroom. The expectation is that it's not limited to the classroom. It's not just about this test or about finishing this paper or getting the format right for that major assignment in this classroom. It's about how does all of this apply elsewhere? How is it playing out in this context in my writing classroom? And then how is it applying elsewhere as well? And so being very explicit about that, I think, is important, and asking questions about what do I know here? How can I apply this elsewhere? Also really important. So those are the three enabling practices. And if I boil them down just so that I can remember them, like I have on the screen here: conceptual knowledge, practice and metacognitive reflection. And I try to do those things in different ways every day in my classes. There are also some working principles in development that I think the statement gives us that also are important. I'll just maybe read this. In addition to the high confidence working principles discussed above, ERS participants, the Elon Research Seminar participants, identified a number of working principles that remain in development. ERS participants have moderate to high confidence in these in development principles, but they merit further research. So 1, with explicit rhetorical education, students are more likely to transform rhetorical awareness into performance. And so I think that goes back to conceptual knowledge that we discussed earlier. Really important. If you have to have conceptual knowledge, you have to understand how something works in order to be able to use it elsewhere. And that's what that first one is about. Second, helping students develop strategies and tools to think about how writing functions in communities can potentially prepare them to draw effectively on prior knowledge when they encounter writing in new settings, whether writing for a major, writing in a workplace, or writing for extracurricular activities. Third one, some dispositions seem to better afford engaged rhetorical problem solving. We are only starting to explore what such dispositions might be, so pedagogy that promotes transfer needs to be attentive to dispositions research. Some physical and digital space designs afford learning and transfer better than others, and the transfer of rhetorical knowledge and strategies between self-sponsored and academic writing can be encouraged by designing academic writing opportunities with authentic audiences and purposes, and by asking students to engage in metacognition. And so I think some of these have to do with classroom practices. Some of them have to do with metacognition. Digital space, I think, is also important, and I'll try to get to all of these, in future podcasts. One thing that just occurs to me about physical and digital space designs right now is I remember an experience. I was probably 15 or more years ago. The university I was working for built a whole building around technology and put computers all through all of the classrooms. And so it was known sort of as the building with all of the computer classrooms in it. And there was a computer lab and stuff, an open computer lab for students. And one thing I remember, when I got in there and had students where everyone had their own workstation. Some of them had workstations, some of them had laptops, desktops and laptops. And I remember a room that had pods in it, and of groups of 4 students each, and each desk had a computer in front of it with a monitor. And I remember struggling so much to get students to interact with each other, because that was something that I liked to have happen. I liked to have them do some things sometimes in groups. I was trying to, put students in their zone of proximal development, get them to work together a little bit, to develop a little, work on a skill that they were unfamiliar with, just to kind of help them, get a boost by putting their heads together. And I just remember how hard it was to get them to even interact with each other with those computers and monitors in the way. So digital or physical space designs could certainly help enable or constrain, I think, interactions with students, just as one example. So there's a lot to unpack there as well. And it looks like that's my last slide. I'm not coming up with any more, so we'll end it here. But I really appreciate the opportunity to do the podcast. I'm grateful for those of you who are listening or watching, and I hope to have more soon. I really do think that the Elon Statement is important for writing, and I hope to show in the podcast some ways in which I use it. And I encourage everybody who's listening to just read it and try to internalize it and use it as much as you can, because it is based on, we'll get into this too, there's a whole bunch of literature in there. I encourage you to go, read it if you haven't, but there is a bunch of literature that they are drawing from cognitive psychology and maybe some other areas that is really important. And it's really kind of enlightening. I really enjoy reading that literature and trying to ask myself how I might use it in my own pedagogy. And, like I said, the Elon Statement itself is a game changer, has been for me. And I would like to thank all of those who worked on the Elon Statement. And we'll get into more of that, of course, as time goes on. But thank you so much for listening. And we will take it up again the next chance I get.